All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. We have the incredible zechus to be able to begin a brand new parak this morning of Bamet Tomnin. Our daf today is 48 Memches. We are starting at Mem Zayin with Bays 47b. We'd like to thank our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Frank and Debbie Spector, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month in deep gratitude to the entire Kehillah, Paul and Kathy Pollock, for dedicating this month's Shiurim and Drashos in memory of Paul's father, Shmuel ben Zechariah, his mother, Sarah Bas Avram, and great-grandmother, Cyril Bas Reb Dov, and also Moshe David and Shmuel Artman and families for dedicating the shir this morning in memory of their aunt, Mindel Perel Bas Yitzchok Leib. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in a Chama. Now, with that, let us begin. So we have the great Zuchos now to be able to begin the next parak, Abba Met Tomnin. So Rabbi say the beginning, although interestingly enough, we are not finished with Muktzah. We're not finished with Muktzah, meaning we haven't done the halacha lamaisa with Muktzah, and in general, we're not finished with Muktzah just yet. We're going to see how that's going to come in even in today's daf. But again, we are going to see that the topic, at least the beginning topic of this parak, is hatmana, is ultimately again insulating. And so let's take a look. We'll see. We'll give a little bit of a hakdama once we start the Mishnah. So it says the Mishnah, with what are you permitted to insulate the pot on Shabbos, and what can you not use for insulation? Then Rabbi say, let's give a bit more context here. Look at Rashi. If a person wants to remove his pot from the stovetop, uletomna b'davar acher, and to insulate. So both say. So let me just give you the image over here. You have a pot on the fire. Let's start with before Shabbos. Sometime before Shabbos, you are going ahead and removing that pot from the fire. You're taking it off the flame. Now, what do you want to do? You want to go ahead and insulate it in order that the pot is able to retain its heat. Then I will say, there is no case of hatmana on a fire. You cannot insulate anything on a fire for Shabbos. But the idea is you want to remove it off the fire and insulate it in order that it retains its heat. So Rashi says, but tomna b'davar achar v'amnu chachamim ein tomnin b'davar hamosif hevel ev ella b'davar hamaymit hevel mihu. So listen to this. So the laws of hatmana are actually not all that complicated. So before Shabbos, you are permitted to insulate your pot with what we call a davar. Let me say it differently. You are never permitted to insulate your pot with a davar hamosif hevel. Apparently, in the world of insulation, there are two different types of insulation that one could use for their pot. What we call a davar hamosif hevel, something that will increase and intensify heat, and davar hamaymit hevel, ultimately again something that only sustains current temperature. So under no circumstances, before Shabbos or on Shabbos, can you ever go ahead and insulate the pot with a davar hamosif hevel, with something that intensifies heat. However, before Shabbos, you can insulate your pot with a davar hama'amit hevel, right? With something that ultimately goes ahead and sustains heat. That's before Shabbos. On Shabbos itself, you cannot insulate even with a davar hama'amit hevel, even with something that ultimately just retains and sustains current temperature. And we'll see the reasons for this on a very basic level. Chazal were concerned that if we allow you to go ahead and insulate with a davar hamosif hevel, right? If we allow you to go ahead and insulate with something that increases temperature, there was a concern gzera shema yatmena beremetz, that you may come to go ahead and insulate the pot with a burning coal. And the problem is we're nervous to have you obviously you can't handle a burning coal on Shabbos. Also concern either of kibui, of extinguishing it, or of havara, of fanning it and kindling it a bit. So therefore, again, we'll see all of this inside. So the Mishnah therefore begins by saying, with what can you go ahead and insulate a pot, and with what can't you insulate a pot? So the first thing we're going to begin in the Mishnah is ein tomnin. You are not permitted to go ahead and insulate the pot with the following materials. Why not? Because these are all materials hamosif hevel, that increase or enhance temperature. So remember again, whether you're doing this on Erev Shabbos or you're doing this on Shabbos itself, you cannot use these items. So what are they? Lo begefes. So we'll say bepashtos begefes, as we're going to see, is olive pulp. Olive pulp. So you can't use olive pulp. Lo bezevel, you can't use manure. Lo bemelach, not salt. Lo besid, not plaster. Lo bechol, and not with sand. Bein lochin, bein yevation, whether it's dry or whether it's wet. Velo beteven, not with straw. Velo bezogin. Zagin, will say, is grape pulp, right? Is the leftover stuff after you go ahead and you crush your grapes. Velo bemuchin. So we'll say muchin. Rashi says kol davar rach karei muchin. Any soft material is called muchin. Kegon semer gefen utilishet semer rach shal behema ugriras begadim beluyim. So we'll say, we're going to see, for example, if you have wool, tufts of wool, we're going to see essentially that muchin essentially represents kind of any unprocessed material that ultimately, again, still has to go and be processed into something else. So you can't insulate with muchin. V'lo ba'asavin, not with grass. Bisman shehin lochin, when the grass is wet. Aval tomnin bohen kishen yevation. But ultimately, you can go ahead and insulate with it when it's dry. So remember, the Mishnah is just giving us examples, but it's the principle that we are a bit more focused on. So you are never permitted on Erev Shabbos or on Shabbos to go ahead and use a davar hamosif hevel to insulate your pot, which has been removed from the fire. So you cannot use a davar hamosif hevel either on Erev Shabbos or Shabbos. The Mishnah gave us all of the examples of dvarim hamosifin hevel. These are all things which increase the temperature of the item you are insulating, therefore asr for use Erev Shabbos and on Shabbos. Says the Gemara. So we'll say the Gemara is going to ask them just some technical questions regarding the items mentioned. So Ibailahu, Gefes shal zeisim tanan. So let's remember again, one of the things the Mishnah mentioned that you cannot use is Gefes. So says the Gemara, Gefes shal zeisim tanan, aval deshum shemin shapir dami. So we'll say, remember again, Gefes, Bepashtos, as Rashi defined it, is olive pulp. So is it only olive pulp and not sesame pulp? In other words, that you can go ahead and insulate with sesame pulp? O dilma, the shum shemin tanan, the chol shekein d'zeisim. I was saying, I remember, the Mishnah just says gefes. Rashi is the one who translates gefes as olive pulp. But the truth is, gefes itself just means pulp. So the Gemara is asking, is the Mishnah Dafka only talking about olive pulp, but the pulp of sesame seeds is not problematic, i.e. it's not mosif hevel, it doesn't increase temperature, and therefore it can be used for hatmana purposes? Or perhaps odilma, or maybe gefes in the Mishnah actually means sesame seed pulp. That's what you can't use, and all the more so you can't use olive pulp. So says the Gemara Tashma. So let's analyze Tashma. The Amr Rabbi Zera Mishum Chad Debei Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Zera said in the name of one of the rabbis in Rabbi Yanai's yeshiva, Kupa Shetamanba. So this is actually an interesting case, which we'll spend more time on. Kupa. So we'll say you have a box. Now you've already put food inside of that box, and there's actually again muchin, right? There's pieces of unprocessed fabric inside of that box. Now the permissibility of that case we're going to deal with separately, but that's the mitzias. You have a box. You know what it's like? It's like a warming box, like the caterer said. It's like a hot box. So you put the food in the box, and there's muchin. There's stuff inside. There's material that's there covering the pot inside of the box. Now watch this. The Bryce says, "Asr lahanicha ala gefes shal zeisim." So we'll say, so what you want to do is you want to intensify the heat of that box. So what do? You want to put the box down on olive pulp. This way it'll heat up the box. So the Gemara says, you're not allowed to do that. Can't do that on Shabbos. So, or I should say even Erev Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Shmamino, shal zeisim. Now we'll say, again, leaving aside the mitzias of that case, which we'll focus on. But what do you see from here? The Brisa specifically mentions what? Olive pulp. Olive pulp. So you see from here that halacha l'maaseh gefes means olive pulp and not sesame seed pulp. To which the Gemara says, So we'll say the truth is, the Gemara says, no, it's not correct. I will tell you, legabe hatmana, when it comes to going out and insulating, The truth is, even sesame seed pulp is problematic. So we'll say, so why does it only mention olive pulp over here, not sesame seed pulp? This is actually very interesting. Le'inyan, top of memches, le'inyan asuke havlo, the zeisim maski havlo, the shumshimin lo maski havlo. Rabbi says is very interesting. There is, again, when it comes to hatmana, when it comes to insulating, so the Gemara is going to suggest that it, just as it is not permitted to insulate with olive pulp, it is also not permitted to insulate the pot with sesame seed pulp. So why is only olive pulp mentioned here? So olive pulp apparently has a very interesting quality in that halacha lemaisa, the heat of olive pulp rises. Masha'en kein sesame seed pulp, it doesn't rise. It doesn't rise. Therefore, in the case of the kupa, they're trying to structure a case where you're placing a box on top of something that will heat it. The mitzias, right, the physical realities of that case only work with olive. Olive pulp doesn't work with sesame seed pulp. Look at the top Rashi, memches amud olive, asuke havlo, kegonzeh shehitmin b'davar acher, v'iniach kupa ala gefes, deleka ela shala gefes my lehevel, lemala, umarsiach kidir shebakupa. Shabbos says, so bottom line, the Gemara says this pulp refers to both olive pulp and sesame seed pulp. Both are considered to be items which are prohibited to insulate on Shabbos because halacha l'maisa they're mosif hevel. They intensify heat. Olive pulp, however, is just different than sesame seed pulp in that the heat of olive pulp rises, which doesn't apply to sesame seed pulp. Okay, so I'll say just a detail. So the Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Zera iklou lebereish kalusa. So we'll say an interesting story. Rabbi Zera went to the house of the Reish Kalusa. Good. Let's remember again, the Reish Kalusa was the head of Babylonian Jewry. Right? Reish means head, Galusa means Galus. He was the head. This was the title. He was effectively he was the leader of Babylonian Jewry. So the Gemara says, Chaz yuha lahu avda da anach kuza de maya pumadukum kuma. So listen to this. So he saw one of the servants, a Jewish servant, in the house of the Reish Kalusa, who put a pitcher of water, puma de kumkuma, right, at the opening of the pot, at the opening of a pot. The Rebbe says, so just if you can imagine what he's doing over here is as follows. He's trying to heat up, right? The servant has like a pitcher or a jug of cold water. He's trying to heat up the cold water. So there's another pot on top of the fire. So what does he do? He takes the cold water and he puts it on top of the other pot. Literally again, apuma de kumkuma means like at the entrance, at the opening of the pot. So if you can imagine, I guess, maybe like a large kettle or a kettle with a very large opening. See, he's going ahead and putting the cold water on top of the opening of the large kettle. Nasye Rava. So Nasye Rava. So Rabba scolded him. He yelled at him. Amr Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Zera says, I don't understand. Why is this different than the case of a mecham gabe mecham? So we'll see this case. This is actually quite fascinating and going to actually be of incredible importance for Hilchos Shabbos for us. Mecham gabe mecham also means that halacha l'maisa, you're permitted to go ahead and put one pot on top of another. Let's say you have a pot on the fire and you want to warm another pot. You could put the second pot on top of the first pot in order to warm the upper pot. So you see that you could take something that is quote unquote colder and you can go ahead and you can I just say, Josh, it's mamish beautiful. Incredible. It's literally vishinamtam livanecha. Incredible, and also babysitting, which is fantastic. So the Gemara says as follows. So why is that different than mecham agabi mecham? Mecham agabi mecham. He'll say, so what's the pshat? What's the pshat? That should be okay, right? To put one pot on top of another pot should absolutely be something. We know that's, again, we haven't seen that case, but we know it's permitted. So why is that different than putting the jug of cold water on top of the opening of the kettle? So the Gemara says, Amarle hasam ukme kamokim, hacha alude kamolid. So as we will see, in the case of what we call mecham agabi mecham, we're going to see that's a case where the upper pot is already warm. You're just trying to retain the heat of that upper pot. That is different than this case where you're taking a jug of cold water and trying to heat it up. So we'll say that's the end. That's the end of that case. I just want to mention a fascinating halacha in this case because it is actually incredibly important. So this is in Siman Shin Yud Ches Siv Yud Zayin. So just listen to this halacha, but just know, again, we're going to spend more time on this because this actually is going to be very important in Hilchos Bishul for us. But listen just to this halacha for a moment. Shulchan Aruch writes, Asr litain sonon al hamecham afilu lahafshir kol shamechem cham kol kach sheilu haya manichu sham harbe hayibet lidei bishul. We will say this is actually an incredibly important halacha. On Shabbos, if you have a cold liquid, and so we know that liquids are subject to bishul achar bishul, right? That if you have a liquid, even if it was cooked, but it cools down, it's once again subject to bishul achar bishul. It's subject to cooking again, which is why, for example, you can't reheat your soup on Shabbos morning, right? You can't reheat your soup because lemaisa, again, the soup is going to be subject to bishul again. What happens if you have a cold liquid? You don't want to heat it up. You just want to take off the chill. That's all you want to do. I need it to be room temperature. So I want to put it somewhere just to take. I have no interest in heating it up to the point that it's hot. I just want to take off the chill. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that you are not permitted to put liquid in any spot where it could become yad soleh despo. So we'll say, even if my intention is only to leave the liquid, let's say on top of the hot pot, where only for 2 minutes just to take off the chill, I don't want it to go ahead and become yad soleh despo. You cannot put a cold liquid anywhere where it could become yad soleh despo, which means hot enough that the hand would recoil. You can't put it there, even if your intention is not to leave it there that long. Very important halacha. So even though my intention is I want to leave it here 2 minutes just to go ahead and take off the chill, halacha lemaisa, you cannot put a cold liquid in a place on Shabbos where it could become yad soleh despo. That's based on this. That's this Gemara. We'll see some greater depth in that as we go on. So the Gemara goes weiter. There's still. So remember, we'll say this is Rabbi and Rabbi Zera in the house of the Reish Galusa. So they're watching this servant do all of this stuff. Hadar chaze de paras dastudar apume de kuba. The anach not leiluye. Next, what did they see? This same servant took off his turban, and he put his turban on top of the jug, right? On top of a jug, and he put the spoon on top of the turban to kind of keep it in place. So it looks like he's covering the jug with his turban, and he's going ahead and putting a spoon on top of it to hold the turban in place. So the Gemara says, Nasei Rabba. Rabba once again scolded the servant. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amai. So Rabbi Zera says to Rabba, what's your problem? Why? The guy's not doing anything wrong. So why are you scolding him? So the Gemara says, Amar Hashta Chazis. So Rabba says, watch. Just watch. Watch what's going to happen. So the Gemara says, L'sov Chazye de Kama Atzerle. Afterwards, they saw that what happened, that ultimately, again, the servant was squeezing the liquid out of the turban, right? The turban had absorbed some of the water from the jug, and the servant was wringing out the turban. The Rabbi say, so you'll say to yourself, what's wrong with wringing out a turban? So remember again, halacha l'maisa, if your clothing gets wet on Shabbos, wringing out the water from the clothing is actually a problem of malavein, actually a problem of laundering on Shabbos, right? Malavein or laundering is one of the lamites malachas, and anytime you wring water out of something, by the way, it's not just clothing. You can't wring water out of a dish towel either. So halacha l'maisa, anytime you go ahead and you wring water out of something, that's the potential of malaving, the potential ultimately again of laundering. So Rabba says, Rabba knew how this story was going to end, and therefore halacha l'maisa, he scolded the servant, don't put your turban on top of the jug. Amar le maishna mi parunka. Why is this any different than parunka? Rashi says parunka. Beged ha'asvei lifros alagigi she'parson also b'Shabbos. So we'll say there were barrel covers. In other words, sometimes people made barrel covers out of cloth, and yet you're allowed to put that on Shabbos. So why is the usage of this turban to cover the barrel any different than a cloth than a cloth barrel cover? Very simple. The Gemara says, "Amalei hasam lo kapediluye, hacha kapediluye." It's very simple. In the barrel cover, no one cares if it gets wet. in a turban, which presumably the servant is going to put back on, he absolutely cares if he gets wet. So we'll say, whereas if you care that the garment gets wet, that's when there's the concern of schita, of wringing it out. But lamaisa, by the barrel cover itself, halacha lamaisa, there's no problem of wringing it out because that's the entire point of the barrel cover. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. V'lo b'teven. So remember again, so the Mishnah continued down the list of the items that you cannot use for hatmana purposes. Why? Because they are mosif hevel. Because they increase and they intensify the heat, the temperature of the pot. So and one of the examples was straw. So Rav Ada bar Masna me Abaye. So Rav Ada bar Masna asked from Abaye, Muchin shetamin bahan. So let's listen to this case. Let's say you used muchin. I will say, remember again, muchin as Rashi defined before in the Mishnah is like unprocessed fabric. So it could be unprocessed wool, it could be unprocessed cotton, it could be unprocessed material that's going to be made into felt, right? All different kinds of unprocessed material. So we'll say, so now watch this. What happens if you used muchin? If you ended up using muchin to go ahead and insulate your pot. So you shouldn't have done it. But now listen to the shaila. But you used it. Now the muchin, let's say, fell off, right? So the muchin fell off from the pot. So what's the shaila? Mahu l'taltlon b'Shabbos. Are they muktzah? So right, is the muchin muktzah or not? So we'll say, what's the shaila? So we would assume that halacha l'maisa, once you go ahead and you, well, let's see. Mahu l'taltlon b'Shabbos. Amrli Abaye. So Abaye says, v'chi mipnei she'ein lo kupa shel teven. Omid umafkir kupa shamuchin. So we'll say, here's the shaila. If you say that the muchin are ultimately, again, items used for hatmana, then when they're no longer being used for hatmana, you could move them, you could do whatever you want to them. If, on the other hand, I look at muchin as valuable material that is to be made and processed into something else, which are actions that cannot be done on Shabbos, then by definition the muchin is going to be muktzah, So we'll say, see here the shaila, if you view the muchin just as an item that was used for hatmana, so when it falls off the pot, it's not muktzah. But if you view the muchin ultimately again as significant material to be processed into some type of finished product, then it will be muktzah on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, so Rav Ada asks Shaila Abayis Amarlei, V'chi mipnei she'in lo kupa shel teven ominu mafkir kupa shel muchin. Then we're saying obviously a person would not normally use muchin for hatmana purposes, right? Normally for hatmana you use invaluable items. Obviously what happened over here is the guy in question didn't have straw, so he used muchin. But just because he's using the muchin for hatmana, do you think that means that he makes it hefker? And therefore, again, even after it's no longer serving in a hatmana capacity, you could just do whatever you want with it? Of course not. In other words, after he finishes with it for hatmana, his intention is still to use muchin for what muchin is used for, which is to produce some type of finished product. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, it is certainly going to be muktzah. Lima misayele. So we'll say this seems to have a support for this. Tomnin b'gizei tzemer u'b'tzipei tzemer u'b'lashono shel argamon u'b'muchin. You are permitted to go ahead and insulate a pot with gizei tzemer, means wool shearings. Tzipei tzemer means uncombed wool. Combed wool, that you've made into mats. Lashono shel argamon, literally again pieces of purple wool. U'b'muchin, and with muchin, ve'im metaltlon osan. But ultimately, again, they are muktzah. And I'll say again, just to understand, why are these items muktzah? Because all of these items are ready to be processed into some type of finished product. Obviously, the processing into a finished product cannot happen on Shabbos. Because it can happen on Shabbos, therefore, halacha l'maisa, these items are muktzah. To which the Gemara says, let's analyze. Imishum ha, so if you think this is a proof, lo iria, because this is not a good proof, I'll tell you why. Hachi kamar. Actually, the way you have to read the Brisa is, maybe you could read the Brisa as saying, these items, if you did not use them for hatmana, they are muktzah. The Gemara says, I don't understand. We'll say, if you have material, if you have wool, right, unprocessed wool, combed wool, purple wool, muchin, so we'll say, if it's just sitting around on Shabbos, it's clear that it's muktzah. It's obvious that it's muktzah. Why? Because these items serve no purpose on Shabbos. Because these items are used ultimately for what? To go ahead and make garments, make items, which can't be done on Shabbos. So of course, if they're not being used for anything, of course they're muktzah. To which the Gemara says, so you will say, I might have thought that since these items can be used, you could use it as a chair. In other words, you could sit you could recline, you could relax in a ball of wool, right? In a ball of muchin. So I might have thought that therefore again, that gives the item a permitted purpose, and because it has a permitted purpose, ultimately one is permitted to go ahead and move it on Shabbos. Kamash mulano. So we'll say this is a throwback for a moment to muktzah. Let's just speak about this for a moment. So we'll say, so remember again, in Hilchos Muktzah, again, we're going to see some of this still. You, for example, have something called the Klisha Malachtu Le'Isr. So a Klisha Malachtu Le'Isr is an item that has a primary prohibited purpose. So therefore again, or I should say, meaning the primary use of the item is for something that is prohibited on Shabbos. And therefore, halacha l'maisi, you can't move it on Shabbos. Now there's an exception. The exception to that rule is, if the Klisha Malachtu Le'Isr has a primary, or I should say, a secondary permitted purpose, then you could move it for that permitted purpose. The paradigmatic example of this in halacha is a hammer. Not as much today, but a hammer. So a hammer is a Klisha Malachtu Le'Isr. It is an object whose primary purpose is prohibited on Shabbos. Because what is a hammer used for? Building. And building is prohibited on Shabbos. Yet, amazingly enough, hammer has a secondary permitted purpose, which is to crack open nuts. Good, to crack open nuts, right? You can't find the nutcracker, you go ahead and you take the hammer, you crack open nuts. So we'll say, therefore, again, if you want to go ahead and bring the hammer to the table to crack open nuts on Shabbos, you are permitted to move the hammer for that purpose. So we'll say, but the only way that works is if that secondary use is a real use. For example, so there, whatever, I'm not going to get into it. Well, I'm going to leave it at this for now. But the Gemara says you might have thought that you could move all of this unprocessed material on Shabbos, because after all, you could use it as a Talmudic beanbag, right? You lay back in the ball of wool. It's gishmak, it's wonderful. The Gemara says, okay, but it's not used for that. People don't do that. In other words, allow a saying that an item has a secondary, in other words, you can make up a permitted use for anything. What the Gemara is teaching me is, it's only called a secondary permitted use if what? If the item is really normatively used in that way. So because people don't use unprocessed materials, at least in times of the Gemara, this way, therefore again, that's not a permitted movement, ultimately again, of these items. Good, says the Gemara. Now what it also tells us is the following. If you use something significant for hatmana purposes, and then afterwards that hatmana item falls out, or you lift the pot out so the hatmana item is sitting there, if the hatmana item, the primary use of that hatmana item, is something that is prohibited on Shabbos, your hatmana material will be muktzah, even though you used it for hatmana on Shabbos. If its primary purpose, like by the muchin, is for something that is prohibited on Shabbos, the muchin will become muktzah. Rav Chisda shar la'adure ujra lebeisajya b'Shabbos. Rav Chisda, an interesting case. He allowed you to go ahead. I will say this is totally switching gears now. Once we spoke about muchin, so I mean, come on. Once you start talking about muchin, you can't stop. So the Gemara says over here, what happens with muchin? So Rav Chisda allowed you to put muchin. I will say was also used as like the stuffing for pillows, mattresses. So Rav Chisda, if you had a pillow and the stuffing of the pillow fell out, so Rav Chisda allowed you to go ahead and put the muchin back in the pillow. Put the right. He permitted him ultimately to do that. So the Gemara says, is that really permitted on Shabbos? Eisvei Rav Chanan bar Chisda, the Rav Chisda. So Rav Chanan bar Chisda raised the shayla to Rav Chisda. Matirin beisat savar b'Shabbos avalo poschin. So we'll see, that's actually very interesting. So when you would go ahead and give your shirt to the launderer to go ahead and clean, so what would they do? They would often, the launderer would sew up the neck opening, right? He would sew up the beisat savar. He would sew it up, right? And I guess it made it easier to go ahead and launder the garment or make sure that it wouldn't rip, so they would sew it up. So let's say, I get my freshly laundered garment back from the launderer on Erev Shabbos. I come to put it on Shabbos, and I realize I didn't undo the stitching. So what's the halacha? What does the Brisa say? Ultimately, again, you are permitted to unstitch the launderer's stitch on Shabbos. You're permitted to do that. However, avalo poschin. But I will say, it would also be that when you bought a new garment, the neck would also be stitched up. So interestingly enough, if you bought a new garment, you can't unstitch the new garment stitching on Shabbos. But if you got it back from the cleaners and forgot to unstitch it before Shabbos, you can unstitch the launderer stitching on Shabbos. I will say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Avalo poskin lechatchila dahashta avid leimana. I will say, watch this. Because when you buy a new garment, the unstitching of the neck is the makkeh bepatish. It's the makkeh bepatish. It's the final piece in the creation of the garment. Masha'in Kain, the launderer stitching, Rabbosai, that was just out of convenience for the launderer. That has really nothing to do with the garment per se. See here the chilik, say if you get a new garment and the neck is stitched up, you can't unstitch that on Shabbos. That's called makkeh bepatish, delivering the final hammer blow and completing something on Shabbos, which is asur. But if you got it back from the cleaners and you forgot to unstitch it before Shabbos, you can unstitch it on Shabbos. But again, I'll say that's not even our focus. But watch this. You cannot put, we'll call it the tuft of material, into your pillow or into your mattress on Yom Tiv, and all the more so on Shabbos. So we'll say here, the Brisa says explicitly that what? You cannot put the stuffing in your pillow or the stuffing in your mattress on Yom Tiv, and certainly not on Shabbos. So that's a contradiction to Rav Chisda. Lokash is not a contradiction. Ha bechadati, ha ba'atiki. They both say it is not a contradiction. One is talking about the new pillow, one is talking about an old pillow. Look at Rashi bechadati, shalo hayu me'olo musocho, asr dahashta avleimana. So we'll say if it's a brand new pillow, they never had stuffing. Of course you can't do that on Shabbos. Why? Because you are completing the utensil. And anytime you complete a utensil on Shabbos, that is makkeh bepatish, delivering the final hammer blow. Rav Chisda was saying, if you have a pillow and some stuff fell out of the pillow, you could put the stuff back into the pillow on Shabbos. That's not called makkeh bepatish. We have a brisa that supports this. The brisa says you can't put in a stuffing into a pillow or into a mattress on Yom Tov or on Yom Tov, certainly not on Shabbos. However, Nishru Machzirino Son b'Shabbos ve'Ein Tzarich L'Or b'Yom Tov. But if you have a pillow and the stuffing fell out of the pillow, you are permitted to go ahead and restuff the pillow on Shabbos and certainly on Yom Tov. So Shabbos says something very. So again, you see this common theme. Anything that represents the completion of a utensil, you cannot do on Shabbos. So a brand new pillow that essentially is being fashioned, and you now want to for the first time put the stuffing in on Shabbos, you can't do that because that's completing the pillow. Same way that if you purchase the garment and the neck is stitched and you want to unstitch it, you can't do that on Shabbos. But to go ahead and just simply repeat the process that's already been done. The stuffing falls out, you want to put it back in, that's fine. That's not making the pillow, that's absolutely fine. Or you got your shirt back from the launderer and the launderer stitched it. Again, I will say, so that's the launderer's convenience. That's a stitch ultimately, again, that's for his purposes. That's not called the completion of the utensil to take that out on Shabbos. Let's go weiter. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So we'll say, so now we're going to go back to this a little bit. So we'll remember again, you get a new shirt, Mazel Tov, you're wearing it on Shabbos for the first time, and you realize that the neck is stitched. It's a brand new garment, the neck is stitched. So the Gemara says, if you go ahead and you open the stitching of the neck of that garment on Shabbos, you are chayiv a chatos. You're chayiv a chatos, which Rabbosai means that you have violated in Isser Doraisa. Look at Rashi, Chayiv Chatos, Tahashta Kamash Vileimana. Because you also remember again, by opening the stitching for the first time on Shabbos, you are making this into a utensil. The Chayiv Mishum Makkeh Bepatish. And you are Chayiv ultimately again because of Makkeh Bepatish, delivering the final hammer blow, which is a malacha on Shabbos. So you're Chayiv Chatos. Maskif le Rav Kahana Amadeus. Rabbi said this is an incredible Gemara. Maskif le Rav Kahana ma benzu lemagufas chavis. Why is this any different than opening the top of a barrel? Look at Rashi. Ma benzu lemagufas chavis tesanya beparak chavis shenishbara mevi adam chavis umatis esro Shabbos saif umanicha lifnei archim. Rabbi just going to say what's happening over here. You have a barrel. The barrel has a lid. The barrel has a lid. Not like we saw in Amud Aleph, a material on top of it. No. Like a solid lid. A solid lid. And I will say, what would they do? They would go ahead and seal that lid onto the barrel with whether it was clay or plaster, or however they did it. Now the halacha is, I will say, but now comes Shabbos, you want the contents of the barrel. So what's the halacha? You're permitted to lop off. You could cut off the top of the barrel. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. If you could cut off the top of the barrel, isn't that making the barrel into a kli as well? Yet we allow it. If that's the case, why can't you undo the stitching, the brand new stitching of the garment? I will say, watch this. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rava, ze chibur v'ze eino chibur. It's very simple. It's very simple. At the end of the day, one is connected and one is not connected. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Megufa eino min achavis atzmo va'af al pisha devuka bo eino chashiv chibur shahari linotil omedes etzel aval habeged kishenerag kulo chibur. Rabbi say, here's the difference. The barrel top is not considered to be part of the barrel. So because it's not considered to be part of the barrel, removal of the barrel top is not called making the barrel into a utensil. Remember, I both say, what would be the potential issue with removing the top of the barrel? But when the top is on, the barrel is inaccessible. When the top is off, the barrel is accessible. So are you not effectively making the barrel into a kli when you remove the top of the barrel? The same way that when you undo the stitching of the shirt, you're making the shirt into a shirt. To which they want to say, here's the fundamental difference. The shirt is one closed entity. Right now, when the stitching is in there, it's unusable as a shirt. L'maisa, once you go ahead and undo the stitching, it's usable as a shirt. The cover was never part of the barrel. It's not part of the barrel. The barrel was a barrel before the cover. It happens to be now you're making the barrel inaccessible because you put the cover on top of it. But when you remove that cover from the barrel, it's not like, ta-da, you've made a barrel. The barrel was there before because that covering is not part, ultimately, again, of the barrel. I will say the reason why this is an incredibly important discussion is this gets into the entire discussion of opening bottles and cans on Shabbos. This is exactly what this is. When you open up your soda bottle on Shabbos, are you making a kli? Are you making a utensil? Or simply what you're doing is, no, you're just re-allowing access to something that was accessible before, but was rendered inaccessible because there's something on top of it, much like the barrel, right? The barrel was a barrel before, just somebody, plumped a lid on top of it, sealed it, and now when you take it off, you're not creating a barrel, not creating anything new. It was a barrel before. It was just now it's accessible, before it was inaccessible. Contrast that with the shirt case, where when the shirt is sewed up, it's not a shirt. When you go ahead and you undo the stitching, you've made it into a shirt. That's makeh bepatish. We'll come back to the bottle cap situation as well. Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raised Rabbi Zera. So I'll say, so just this is why this is incredible. Just want to point out, we just started a new parak about Hatmana. It took the Gemara like about 3.5 minutes to get off topic, right? So I just want to point out, you didn't miss anything. Like I know maybe some of you might think I thought it was about Hatmana. It was about Hatmana. Now again, we're on a different topic because we got a little bit sidetracked. Ultimately, again with makeh bepatish essentially. So watch this. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. So Rabbi Yirmiyah raised the following to Rabbi Zera. Tanan shalosh shel kovsin vishal shalosh shel maftechos va'beged shu tafar bekilayim chibur l'tuma. So let's listen to this case. Now, Shalosh Shel Kovsin, Rashi points out, Darkom Lishlo HaBegadim Zeim Zeh Ketanim Im Gidon Gedei Shlo Yaveid. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. You would give your clothing to a launderer. So what a launderer would often do is, a launderer would stitch, a temporary stitch, but would stitch a number of garments together. Remember again, maybe they were laundering by the river or somewhere else. You want to make sure that none of the garments get lost. So what they would do is they would stitch together all of the garments that they were washing. Or I will say that's shalshela shamatechos is a keychain, right? Keys that are linked together through some type of stitching as well. V'habeged shutar bekilayim. I will say beged shutar bekilayim is an interesting case, for example, of two pieces of wool that are tied together with linen string. Now they were just tied together temporarily in order that one should not lose the different pieces of material. They're not meant to be stitched together forever. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So in all of these cases, In all of these cases, chibur l'tuma. We'll say since these items are stitched together, they're considered to be one unit for tuma purposes, which means if one item in the line becomes tamei, everything else becomes tamei. So we'll say, so when the launderer is doing the laundry, if one of the garments that's stitched to all the other garments becomes tamei, everything becomes tamei. One key on the keychain becomes tamei. They all become tamei. One of the pieces of wool that's stitched to a piece of wool with linen thread. They will say, now I have to understand the chap of all of these items is they're attached now, but it's clear that they're all going to be detached. Right? In the shatnez case, when you have wool pieces, when you have wool fabric attached with linen string, of course it's going to be detached. It's shatnez. The keys are not going to remain together. The launderer's item, remember again, those garments might belong to a variety of different people. So of course they're not going to remain stitched together. In all of these cases, you have items that are connected, but are not going to remain connected. Yet, nevertheless, they are connected for tuma purposes. Once one of them becomes tamei, they're all tamei. Alma, what do you see from here? Shelo b'shas malacha, not michibar. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, ad sheyaschil lahatir. So they're all considered to be connected for tumah purposes until you begin the process of actively unstitching them. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. So for example, let's just use the launderer's case because it's the easiest one. Once the launderer begins to detach the garments, even if they're not all fully detached, if one of them becomes tamei, it doesn't convey tumah to all of them. In other words, we'll say, in order to go ahead and essentially undo the attachment of these items, you don't even have to fully physically detach them. Rather, once you begin the process of detaching them, they are considered to be detached. Rashi points out, the maisa motzi mide maisa, miad maisa. V'chevan sheizchel lahatir, once you begin the process of detangling them, then halacha l'maisa, they are considered to be detached and separate items. Okay, Rabbi say, but what does this show us? Alma shelo b'shas malacha nam b'chibar. Rabbi say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, even items that are attached, not b'shas malacha. Now, what does this mean? Look at Rashi. Shelo b'shas malacha could go in shalom shel kofsin shelo hutzrach l'shololo ela mishum b'shas kibos v'afilu hachi chashiv lechibar achar kibos. Then I both say, now here's what's interesting. You see from here that halacha l'maisa, even when something is attached for non-necessary purposes, that non-necessary attachment still creates a chibur. Right, still creates a connection. So even though, again, you don't have to have these items attached, it's not a necessary attachment, but it's an attachment nevertheless for purposes of tumah. Let's contrast that. Or minhu, makil sha'asi yad lekardum, if you have an axe handle that you made for an axe, chibur l'tumah b'shas malacha. So we'll say, what's the halacha? When the axe handle is in the axe head, they are considered to be connected for tumah purposes. So for example, if I'm chopping wood, right, and my axe head comes in contact with something that is tamei, so ultimately, again, the axe head conveys tumah to the handle as well. Then I will say, now, of course, the chiddush of that is, under normal circumstances, what we call pshutei kli'etz, which means wooden utensils that do not have a receptacle are not mekabel tumah. Yet in this case, because the wooden receptacle, the wooden item is attached to the axe head, so when the axe head becomes tamei, the axe handle becomes tamei. But I will say, if you notice, lashon of the braysa is it's only b'shas malacha. It's only when the axe handle is being used, functionally being used with the axe. B'shas malacha and shelo b'shas malacha lo. It's only when the axe handle is attached to the axe head. But if the axe handle, it's only when the axe is being used for malacha. But let's say, for example, something that's tamei comes in contact with the axe head. When the axe is not being used in malacha, ultimately, again, it would appear that the axe handle does not contract tumah as a result of that connection. So I will say this poses a contradiction, because beforehand, let's say with the launderer, the only time that the connection is not called the connection is when the launderer begins to actively detach them. But it sounds like Rabbi say, let's say the launderer has everything in a pile, right? He's not doing anything with it, and one of the items becomes tamei. It sounds like by definition, everything else does become tamei. So that's a contradiction, to which the Gemara says no. Here's the difference. I will say by the axe, when the axe is not being used, Adam asur lezarko lobeina eitz. I will say it was common that if a person would put in like a temporary axe handle into the axe head, and therefore it was very common that after a person was no longer using the axe for malacha, they'd pull out the handle and throw it in the pile of wood. So lemaisa, again, when the axe is not being used, the handle is not really considered to be a part of the axe. However, hacha, when it comes, for example, with the launderer's clothing, shelo b'shas malacha nami nechale di mitnefu hader machverlehu. So Rabbi say this is very interesting. In the case of the launderer, Rabbi say, even after the launderer finished laundering the clothing, he still has a vested interest in keeping the stitching in until he's going to return the clothing to the owner. Why? Because Rabbi said, let's say for some reason the clothing becomes soiled again before he's able to return it back to the owner. This way, again, he doesn't have to restitch the items to wash them. Rather, they're ready to be washed again. Which we'll say is simply another way of saying like this. As long as a person has a vested interest in the connection of the items are called connected. And therefore, once one of them becomes tamei, they all become tamei. But in a metzius, where a person doesn't have a vested interest in the connection. For example, in the axe, once I'm not using the axe, I don't care if the axe head is there or not. I could just as easily take the axe head and throw it into a pile of wood. So therefore, when the axe is not being used, the axe handle is not considered to be connected to the axe head. And therefore, if the axe head becomes tamei, that doesn't impact the handle. By the launderer's stitching, the launderer has a vested interest that the clothing remains stitched together until he returns it back to the owner. This way, should something happen, I have to relaunder it again, I'm ready to relaunder it now, don't have to restitch it. Besura masna la lahashmaita mishmei de Rav Chisda. Bepopodisa masnu mishmei de Rav Kahana. So we'll say in Surah, they conveyed this ruling in the name of Rav Chisda. In Pumpadisa, they conveyed this ruling in the name of Rav Kahana. Avarmele mishmei de Rava. Man tana hamil sadam rabbanon. Kala mechuber harehu kamor. We'll say who is the in others conveyed this. Right? Others conveyed the following idea. Mantana mil sadam. Who is the author of the statement by the Rabbanon that anything that is attached to something else has the same status of the item it is attached to? Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir. Because what does Rabbi Meir say? Rabbi Meir is this nan beis hapachu beis hatavlun beis hanesha bekira. So we'll say this is actually a very interesting case. We'll start it, but then we'll have to stop. So we'll say this case is really quite fascinating. You would have a stove, right? The kira is a stove. Now, both say the way they used to have the setup of their stoves is they would have like other things hanging on the stove. So if you can imagine, you have your stovetop, and then you would have receptacles. But these receptacles would have like a little bit of a lip that was able to attach them to the side of the stove. And what would you put? What would you put in these receptacles? Ultimately, again, they would have a beis hapach or a beis hatavlin. So we'll say so they would go ahead. They would go ahead and have beis hapach, right? So beis hapach would be a receptacle that you would put oil in to warm up oil. Beis hatavlin was a receptacle that you would go ahead and place spices in, so that you could spice the food. Beis haner, you would put a candle. So these were all little kelim that you would put on this. They had a lip. You would hang it on the side of the stove. So what's the halacha? Metamin b'magave, metamin ba'avir, div Rabbi Meir. So we'll say ultimately again, Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa, if the stovetop becomes tamei, so ultimately again, they would go ahead and become, so if the stovetop becomes tamei through maga, through contact with a tamei item, these receptacles become tamei as well. However, ve'metamin ba'avir, but if the tanur, if the kira becomes tamei through the avir, I will say avir is the airspace. Because remember again, halacha l'maisa, earthenware utensils can become tamei through airspace as well. Ultimately, again, that would not be metame the receptacles. Reb Shimon says ultimately, again, the whole thing is we'll have to stop over here. I will pick up with this case in Meretz Hashem tomorrow with the impact of tuma, if the kira becomes tamei, if the stove becomes tamei, the impact of the tuma of the kira on the receptacles that hang onto the kira. Meretz Hashem, we'll pick up with that tomorrow. Shkach, I will say, Mazel Tov for starting the new parak. Just to remind you, tomorrow morning is Rosh Chodesh, so we'll begin with the daf in Meretz Hashem at 5:45, to be followed by Shachris at 6:30. Shkoyach to everyone. We'll start as soon as my shir, whoever's davening today is ready to start.